Hello everyone, this is Horrors with Holly. I am Holly and these are the horrors that keep us awake at night. Hello guys and welcome. I'm actually really excited to talk about this one because it is a bit of a doozy. So today I will be talking about the case of Brian Cohee Jr. For those that don't already know, he at the age of 19 was working part-time while living with his parents still in Grand Junction in Colorado. His parents owned successful businesses. His father worked, his mother worked and ran a daycare from their family home. Now, Brian Cohee Jr. also has the same name as his father, Brian Sr., so I'll refer to him as Brian Jr. throughout the video. So Brian Jr. had a troublesome childhood. He was mercifully bullied, picked on and teased for his awkwardness. He didn't seem to really fit in with many of the friendships and peers in his school. He didn't seem to like his neighbours very much. He definitely had trouble making and maintaining friendships and relationships. People just found him quite odd. Brian was diagnosed with ADHD. His parents noticed that there was some differences that he would need help with, and so they contacted doctors and professionals to have him assessed for things like autism, ADHD. He had behavioural issues that did intensify over time. It's said that his peers started to feel quite uneasy around him, and he had quite a very morbid sense of humour. He made very dark, morbid jokes. He would actually tell his parents, his mum in particular, these jokes that he found quite funny, and she would tell him that these unsettling jokes are not funny at all. They are completely misplaced and they are not funny things to be joking about. He found that they were funny and that people just didn't get his sense of humour. Now, like I said, during his childhood and teens, he did struggle to make and maintain any friendships, mostly due to his fascination with the dark and the morbid, and with his humour revolving around death and violence, and just generally making people feel on edge and unnerved. At any chance that he got to make people feel uncomfortable, he would take that opportunity and push it as far as he possibly could. So at the beginning of all of this, as mentioned, his mum did reach out to professionals for help and had him assessed for autism and possible mental health issues. It was identified by the professionals that Brian did in fact have autism and ADHD, as well as some significant mental health problems. He was put on medication. From the doctor's advice that Brian's mum had been given, she did contact several organisations for looking for help and some guidance for her son, but unfortunately not many of them were able to actually offer any help, and so she would phone the next organisation and they would kind of give her the same sort of answer until there was pretty much nobody left to call. So in terms of professional mental health help, it was lacking there for Brian. Brian was suspended from high school a couple of times as well for a number of incidents. One of those incidents was him being in possession of nunchucks on the school grounds. Although he states that he was given them by another student who also had a pair, it's alleged that this student also had a pair of nunchucks. They wasn't suspended, and so he found that quite unfair and unreasonable. He was also suspended for provoking a panic attack in a student who had quite heightened sensory issues and sensitivities to loud noises, and he supposedly came up behind her and clapped really loud next to her ears, which of course made her have a panic attack. So yeah, this deep-seated need to make people uncomfortable was definitely there, was definitely right within Brian. And even with these problems, Brian managed to graduate high school and find a part-time job at a local grocery store. He generally got along with his co-workers, although his behaviour was different to the norm, and they believe his oddities were just simply quirks. There was nothing that stood out other than that he was just a bit odd. Brian had taken a deep headfirst dive into the field of forensics, anatomy, DNA, crime scene analysis, criminology, profiling. He seemed to really have this deep interest, and although he had this kind of morbid, dark sense of humour, he seemed to be channeling this into something good, and that it may be something that he could potentially go into further education for. And so she supported this interest by purchasing educational textbooks for him to research and read up on, and he spent a lot of time researching these topics and educating himself on law and profiling and crime scene evidence and serial killers and all the statistics that all of that entailed. And so she hoped that he would pursue this as a career option, maybe. And so things went on as normal until one night, the evening of the 27th of February in 2021, Brian's parents were woken up in the middle of the night with an alarming phone call from their son Brian Jr. telling them that he and his car had been submerged in water at the local boat ramp. And although he was able to get out of the car quite quickly to safety, his car was almost fully submerged in the water and he would need help recovering it. They immediately rushed out to find their son, who was still beside the river, soaking wet, and his car was bonnet first into the water. So they kind of grab hold of Brian Jr., bundle him up in their car, and they phone for police to come and assist, and they start phoning around multiple tow truck companies to see if they would come out. I mean, it's in the middle of the night. They want to get the car out as soon as possible and get it transported back to their property. And pretty much everyone they spoke to said it was late. They didn't want to get wet, they didn't want to go into the water, and they wouldn't really be able to do it, or they would come the next day. So the police soon arrived to assist, and they talked to Brian and his parents to find out what exactly had happened that night. Brian is sat in his parents' vehicle in the passenger seat with no trousers on, trying to get warm, and the police talk to his parents first, and they tell him, we was woken up during the night. He said he was out sitting here thinking, and the car, he lost control of the car and it slid down into the water. So they go and speak to Brian in the car to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and just figure out what's going on. It could be a case of drink driving and he's lost control of the car. They have to kind of at least check boxes just to make sure that this is a simple mishap and not something that they have to kind of look into further. So Brian says to the police officer that he was out driving as he needed to think. He just wanted some space, and he parked up on the boat ramp to sit quietly, saying that he pulled up and thought, why not park here and relax a little bit. But as he tried to drive back up to drive away, his back end slid to one side. He tried to pull forwards and that didn't work, so he tried shifting gear and kind of shimmying the car to try and wiggle his way out. That didn't work, and he inevitably lost control of the car and it just slid down into the water, and there was nothing he could really do about it besides clamber out and get to the side of the embankment. There's this soaking wet kid sat there, he's got no trousers on. They're all just having a bit of a laugh and a joke about it, trying to make light of the situation. I'm sure his ego is pretty bruised already. And Brian mentions that, it's probably just cost him about $7,000 with his car possibly being totaled. Although the one thing from seeing the police footage is, for any teen, I think, who has to phone their parents in the middle of the night to say they've just had a silly accident and they need help getting their car that's been submerged in water out, you would think they would be pretty darn nervous. I mean, even if it is an accident, you would still be worried that you would be in some sort of trouble with your parents or with the police officers. But Brian Jr. seems totally chilled, calm and collected, like nothing has happened, and he's just kind of going with the flow. He is completely well mannered and polite with everyone around him, and like I mentioned, he's talking with the police and his parents, explaining what's happened, and they all have a bit of a joke about it. So after waiting a number of hours for a tow truck who was willing to come and actually help recover the vehicle, police managed to find a company that will come and do it there and then. The police tell Brian's mother that he's free to go, he can go home, he can get, you know, warm and sort himself out, because it's not a crash, it's not something that needs to be investigated, it's just a simple mishap, an unfortunate event that's just taken place. So his parents take him home where he gets showered and warm and says he's going to go to bed and, you know, try and get some sleep. And his parents go back up to the site of the incident and wait for the tow truck to try and tow his car out of the water. So as they're sitting in the car and the police are assisting, the car starts to raise up out of the water, and the police notice something. They go over to Brian Sr. and Terry and ask, did anything happen with Brian this evening? Is he hurt? It's just as the car's coming up out of the water, it seems as though there's some sort of red residue on the boot of the car. He says, I don't know whether you can see, but there's like red kind of dripping from around underneath the license plate. It kind of looks like blood. Did Brian hurt himself? Has he hurt himself and not actually realised with all the adrenaline and everything? So Brian's mom calls him there and then and asks him, she explains what they can see on the car. Has he hurt himself? Is he sure? Brian Jr. is adamant that he's totally fine, he doesn't have any injuries, he has no idea what this is or how it could have gotten there, and he is just as confused as them, I guess. And although it's a little bit odd, everyone just accepts that it's nothing to worry about, you know, it's just one of them things. Brian Jr. does mention that it could possibly be fake blood that had, like a drum of fake blood that had exploded in his boot, or the tub had cracked and it had leaked in his boot from his special effects course that he had taken previously, and his mom knew of this course, so she thought that was a totally reasonable explanation as to what it could be. So the next day the car is dropped back at the residence, and Brian Sr. is cleaning out the car, trying to get it sorted out for Brian Jr. He's cleaning all the rubbish out and trying to get all the water out and see what kind of water damage has happened to the car. They know that with the battery getting wet, it wouldn't start, or there was some kind of electrical fault with the car, so it wasn't working properly, and they would have to have it then towed to a garage for them to sort and fix. But while Brian Sr. is cleaning out the car, he is kind of throwing everything from the car into a trash bag, and he opens the glove box and there's a big ass knife in the glove box, and as any parent would, you think, what on earth, why? So he calls up his son straight away, Brian Jr, and says, I've just found a big knife in your glove box, what is this about? Brian says, I just keep it there for protection, I don't always feel safe driving around town, it's just there if anything really bad happens, I don't really know what to say. So Brian Sr accepts this and continues cleaning out the car, and when he goes round to the passenger side to clear out the door card, he notices that down the side of the seat is a wallet. So he pulls the wallet out, doesn't recognise it as being his son's, opens it up and it's a stranger's wallet and thinks that's really odd. And again he phones up Brian and says, I've just found a wallet, what is this? Why is this in the car? And he says, I don't know what to tell you, Dad, I found it at the boat ramp, I left it in the car, I just forgot about it. And his dad asks him, why is there a wallet in your car and why did you not tell us? And Brian Jr says, well, with all the excitement of everything that was going on over the weekend with the car and having it towed out, and I just completely forgot. I didn't think it was relevant or worth mentioning, I guess. But Brian Sr. thinks that it is odd. He goes through the wallet and tries to find some sort of identification of whose it is. He finds a couple cards, one that gives him some indication as to where he might work, and then another one is his like social security identification, and he calls up where he believes he may work and says, I have this wallet, reads out the details, and the lady he speaks to on the phone says, yeah, I know who this is. He's actually missing. We can't find him. Nobody's seen him since Saturday evening. Where did you find the wallet? You know, and they have a bit of a conversation, and Brian Sr. actually leaves his details with the person he was speaking to and says, you know, if you see him, here's my details, have him call me up and I'll get the wallet over to him. And that's how they leave it. But someone actually had a really bad feeling about this missing person not too far away at all on March 1st 2021 at the Blue Heron boat ramp. A lady calls down to the police department and reports that one of the people that she knows very well, knows his routine, has not been seen since Saturday evening, and she's concerned and worried about his whereabouts because it's completely unusual and unlike him to not come by the store, not be sat in his usual place. She would put a chair out for him to read his books at the side of her bridal shop, and he hadn't been there. So she had a really strange, awful gut feeling that something might be wrong. And this man's name was Warren Barnes. He had no fixed abode at that time, but he did have somewhat of a routine. So for him to have not shown up to the bridal store to say hello and sit reading his books, it was unlike him. It was out of the ordinary, and people were starting to become really concerned. So going back to Brian's car, which has been cleared out by his dad, had been then towed over to the local garage to be fixed up. And given the findings in the car and the weird circumstances around the weekend's events with the car sliding down the boat ramp and the knife and the wallet, his parents begin to feel like something is definitely off. Especially Brian's dad, Brian Sr. And while he is dealing with the car, Terry, Brian's mom, is at home with children that she's watching at the daycare centre she runs from home. She's cleaning up around the house and tidying up in Brian's room. And he had this kind of plastic container in his wardrobe, and as she is cleaning, she notices like this whole mess in there, and as inquisitive moms do, you wonder what the mess is and you go about cleaning it up. So she goes into his closet, does a little bit of digging around, and she finds something so concerning, so distressing and so horrific and so heart-wrenching for her mother, and she has no option but to immediately phone the police on her own son. So in the midst of this shocking discovery, she has to phone the parents of the children that she is watching over that day and tell them to come and pick their children up due to a family emergency. She phones Brian Sr. and tells him he has to get over there right now, and he makes his way over to the house. They phone Brian Jr. and tell him that he needs to come back to the house. They tell him that his brother needs the car that he is using and he needs to come back and hand the keys over right away. He was with a friend at that time and he dropped her off home and then hauled ass all the way home. And as he turns up outside, Brian is met by his dad, who kind of keeps him outside, and his mom is in the garden on the phone to the 911 operator who is dealing with the phone call. So she is telling them what she found in her son's wardrobe.
Hi, there is an emergency. I found something in my son's closet wrapped in a plastic bag.
Okay, what was it?
I think it's some human food.
And the police very quickly arrive at the home. They see Brian Jr. and Brian Sr. As they pull up, they get out of the vehicle and go over to greet Brian Jr. They're kind of cool, calm and collected and ask him like what's going on. The police are scanning the area as they approach Brian, and he walks over quite calmly to the police officer with his hands in his pockets, and the police ask him, your parents have some concerns about something they may have found in your wardrobe, is that right? And Brian replies, yeah, I believe so. Police ask him, okay, well what might that be? And Brian kind of looks away for a second, seems to take a bit of a breather for a sec, and then he looks back and says, a human head and hands. It's a human head and hands.
Parents have some concerns of some stuff they may have found in your room?
Yeah, I believe so.
And what would it be?
A human head and hands.
And immediately the police are then asking, do you have anything sharp on you? And he says, no, just my phone and my keys. So they tell him to turn around, put his hands on his head, and they pat him down and pop him in the back of their police car, where the female officer keeps an eye on him, and he is not fazed one bit. He doesn't seem to react with any emotion whatsoever, almost like it's one big joke. He very calmly walks over with the police officer. She sits him down in the back of the police car. They have a bit of a chit chat. She offers to get him some water. He's very well mannered, and he's quite happy to just sit there and wait for the events to unfold. As this is happening, Brian's father is stood pretty much silent, in shock. And Brian's mother is on her hands and knees, completely, totally shattered on the front lawn. She's just inconsolable, sobbing. The police asked to be walked inside the house to check what Brian's mum had found, because they need to know whether they are actually dealing with human remains. And they are led into the house by Brian Sr. He takes them into the kitchen, and in a plastic bag in the sink, covered over with a towel, is indeed a human head. There is a second bag which contains Ziploc bags with human hands in. While this is happening, Brian's making idle chit chat in the back of the police car with the female officer. He mentions that he hasn't been feeling too well recently, and that in the past few days he'd been feeling really anxious, which, very surprisingly, if you have something so horrific hiding in your wardrobe. So he's driven to the police station for questioning, and on the way he actually points out the crime scene where he carried out this disgusting act. He points out exactly where it was, names the bridge in which it took place, and that it's not actually that far from the police station. So he's taken in, put into an interrogation room. He, again, still very cooperative, very polite, well-mannered the whole time, and the police take in Brian's parents to speak to them first. They explain about the boat ramp incident. So Brian's mum begins to explain the boat ramp incident and how her husband was cleaning out their son's car, that he had found the wallet, and the police noticed the blood on the boot of the car when it was being recovered. She tells them about this special effects course that Brian had taken, and that his explanation was it was most likely fake blood that had been in the boot of his car and had made this mess. So she explains how she is cleaning up in his room, finds something really heavy covered in what she thought was maggots, and takes it to the sink and opens it up, and that's where she discovers that it is in fact what looks like a head. Brian's dad has the same kind of version of events. He explains that he's cleaning out the car, he finds the knife in the glove box, the wallet with the ID cards, and that he calls around to try and figure out who the wallet belongs to. He explains that he realises he is missing and starts to get this really bad feeling. So they spend over 2 hours with Brian Jr, and the whole time he's telling the investigators in full grim and gruesome detail how he drove around that night until he found poor Warren sleeping under a bridge, not even that far from the police station. He popped up on the road, got out, and started to brutally attack him with a knife. While he's telling them how the events took place, he begins to reenact the whole scene. He gets down on the floor and shows them how he drove the knife over the top of his head. He takes out a whiteboard marker that's sitting on the desk in front of him, and he begins to draw a map behind him as to where it took place, the road, the scene, where they could find all the body parts. He even then pinpoints where he's going to draw a more detailed map of that specific area, which is where they would find limbs that he states he was throwing behind him as he was committing this murder. So the whole time he seems excessively thirsty, and he's shaking his knee a whole lot as if he's anxious to have been caught. But was it that, or was it this undeniable excitement of reliving it and being able to tell his elaborate, shocking story with all his theatrics? Brian Jr. explains how once he was almost done, Warren's head was almost decapitated. He said that when he first climbed on top of him, Warren was asking why, and the whole time he said he was growling like an animal and making animal noises. He said he didn't know why. That's just what came out of him. But he didn't stop there. He went on to cut off several of Warren's limbs. He cut into his abdomen. He scattered the limbs around the scene, throwing them behind him as he went. He said he destroyed his eyes and gave him a Glasgow smile, which is essentially where you kind of cut this larger from ear to ear smile. He said he then went home to try and sleep. He washed his clothes twice, but he was too concerned with the thought of him possibly leaving evidence at the crime scene. He was worried about fibres that he may have left there. So he got back up, got in his car, drove back over to the scene and put Warren's torso in the trunk of his car and attempted to dump it at the boat ramp, which is where his car slid into the water. He went on to explain how he used pizza boxes and bags to take his head and hands home with him. He explains his extensive knowledge throughout this interrogation of criminology and crime scene evidence, how he used latex gloves layered over one another to protect his fingerprints from being left at the scene. He said how he wore a Michael Myers type mask and boiler suit, one, to not leave evidence at the crime scene, and also because he believed that Halloween outfit made him think of violence, which is why he wore it. He said once he was done, he was chanting dirty, stinky, stinky, dirty over and over again. Although he explained he didn't even know why. He didn't smell anything bad. He was just saying those words. I think it's worth mentioning though that it's a bit coincidental that there is a previous social media post of Brian's with him pictured holding a piece of paper, and his tag name is That Stinky Boy. He goes on to explain how during his research he has come up with the 3 rule, which is something along the lines of within 3 hours rigor mortis takes place, within 3 days something else, 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years. And as he's explaining this to the investigators, he's sporadically stopping to kind of feed his ego, like, am I right? Is that right? And the things that he is actually right about, and the investigators agree with what he's saying, his ego is kind of stroked and he becomes visibly excited and like a young boy being praised. The police are very detailed with their line of questioning, and they ask him how long has he been planning this? Did he know who he was going to attack? Has he tried to attack before but chickened out? And Brian Jr. explains that no offence, but police don't seem to care for high risk individuals like the homeless or sex workers, so he deliberately looked for someone like that. He said that he wanted to know what it was like to cut off someone's limbs, and that's why he did it. He wanted to know what murder feels like, and that's exactly why he did it. During the search of his electronic devices, it was found that in February, Brian was googling things like how to cope with murderous thoughts, homicidal ideation, homicidal thoughts every day, how do people react to being held at knife point or during a home invasion. He was also researching and googling different infamous serial killers and their kill counts. And because he is so much of a talker, they lead the line of questioning down as to whether he had been experiencing voices in his head, whether he felt like he had any delusions, whether he felt paranoid. And they did this to gather whether he would go down the route of an insanity plea, whether that is something that they could then rely on in court as to what his state of mind was during the line of their questioning. Brian Cohee Jr. did plead not guilty by reason of insanity in January 2022, and this provoked a psych evaluation. During one of the talks, he explained that this had happened and it sucked, and when they asked him what sucked about it, he said because he is locked up now and he missed his video games and the internet. Not once did he express any guilt or remorse for what he had done or for his victim, and I think that just goes to show how much of a cold-blooded killer this teen was. It does come out in the discussion with the investigations that he had attacked a stray cat in the area in 2018 around Halloween. It's also found that his parents found a bag full of hammers, shovels, knives, and things like zip ties, saws, duct tape, and when they found this and asked Brian about it, he just kind of explained it away, and they says to him, gave him an ultimatum, he would have to let them throw it all away and get rid of it all, or they would phone the police, and if they ever found anything like it again, they would phone the police. So I think there's red flags already there. A permanent metal memorial was installed next to the town's bridal shop where Warren liked to spend a lot of his time sitting outside reading. It's a metal chair with books stacked up next to it with some of his favourite book titles written on the books, and his favourite saying was inscribed on one of the books also. So what do we think? How many red flags are too many? But that is it for today's case, and I hope to see you in the next one.